31-year-old Linda Slaten lived in Lakeland, Florida. She had two sons, 12-year-old Tim and 15-year-old Jeff. On the morning of September 4th of 1981, Linda's sister Judy Butler had gone to their home so the two could have coffee. But when she arrived, Judy found her sister's body and quickly called 911. Linda was laying on the bed with a wire hanger wrapped around her neck. She had been assaulted and strangled. Investigators who arrived at the scene had to break the news to her two sons. They found Jeff sleeping in the living room and told him to put on some clothes and go outside. Once outside, Jeff saw what looked like every cop in the state of Florida, news crews, and his Aunt Judy was out there crying. Judy then told him what had happened to Linda. In the second bedroom, an officer woke up Linda's other son, Tim. Still in his pajamas, Tim walked past his mother's closed bedroom door. The door then swung open as an officer left the room. He then saw the whole crime scene. Investigators believed that the perpetrator entered Linda's bedroom window as the screen had been removed. They also found a palm print on the windowsill. Furthermore, they were able to collect DNA belonging to an unknown man from her body. Investigators then tried to learn more about Linda to try to find if the person responsible was someone close to her. They looked at Linda's ex-husband, Frank Slaten. She divorced him in 1974 when she was 24 years old. He was a violent alcoholic and would turn abusive and hit Linda. Even though he was an asshole, investigators could not link him to the crime. Another person investigators looked at was Jeff Slaten. They interviewed him a few times but could not prove that he was responsible either. Investigators also looked into Joe Mills. 20-year-old Mills was Tim's football coach at school. After getting divorced, Linda struggled for work, made her own clothes to save money, and could not afford a car. Mills then drove Tim to and from practice every day. Investigators could not link Mills to the crime scene either. Sergeant Edgar Pickett worked at the Lakeland Police Department as a fingerprint expert. He scoured the entire crime scene and was the one that found the palm print on the windowsill. The palm print and the DNA taken from Linda's body was stored so it could be used at a later date. Jeff and Tim moved in with their grandparents, Clarence and Margaret Harris. They were terrified and almost never left the house. They all slept in the same room except Grandpa Harris. He would stand guard with a gun all night while they slept. The grandparents hoped a quick return to familiar routines would help their distraught grandsons. A few weeks after their mom's funeral, the boys were back in school. They decided to focus on football. This is a photo of Tim's football team, taken a month after Linda's life was taken. Tim hung the photo in his bedroom. He said it reminded him of something his mom taught him, to keep moving forward and never giving up. In recent years, Jeff and Tim stated that there is still grief and guilt for not hearing anything that night, for not coming to their mom's rescue. In March of 1999, investigators had developed a full DNA profile of the person that took Linda's life. All they needed was a match. Detective Brad Grice took over the case in 2001. He took dozens of DNA samples from prior persons of interest, submitting them to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement for comparison. Detective Grice then met with Jeff and Tim. He took DNA samples from the brothers to clear them again. He also promised them that he would not retire until he solved their mother's case. Frank Slaten, who had stopped drinking, also volunteered a sample, but none matched. Then, in September 2001, Detective Grice got a tip. Nearly a year after Linda's life was taken, a 24-year-old man named Jimmy Ulmer pulled a 10-year-old girl through her bedroom window and nearly took her life. Ulmer was convicted of that and sentenced to 80 years in prison. The savage assault seemed eerily similar to Linda's case. Furthermore, Detective Grice discovered that around the time Linda's life was ended, Jimmy Ulmer had been staying with a friend who happened to live in the very same apartment complex as Linda. Detective Grice, along with Jeff and Tim, felt confident that they had their man. Ulmer passed away in prison in 1996, but Grice got a DNA sample from his mother. When his DNA did not match the DNA from the crime scene, it was a massive disappointment. It felt like they were back to square one. By 2005, Detective Grice was headed up to a new cold case unit and got the FBI to run the DNA profile continuously through all federal databanks. But the years continued to pass without a match. In 2015, Detective Grice had medical problems which forced him to retire, meaning he unfortunately couldn't keep his promise. All hope was not lost, however, as in 2018, groundbreaking DNA technology began to electrify the law enforcement community. Genetic genealogist Cece Moore decided to take on Linda's case. She is a renowned expert in the field of investigative genetic genealogy. Cece has been responsible for solving so many cold cases, many of which have been covered on this channel. Moore uploaded the DNA profile to a public genealogy website called GED Match. She then meticulously constructed branch by branch the culprit's family tree. She made these connections by poring over birth certificates, marriage license, obituaries, and social media to fill in the family tree with names. Moore explained that she uncovered 3 branches of the perpetrator's family tree that ultimately narrowed to the one person most likely responsible. She said that the 3 genetic networks converged into one family tree that pointed at one immediate family. The man was the only son in that family, so it had to be him. That was the DNA contributor. After hundreds of leads and dead ends, after dozens of suspects were investigated and cleared, Cece Moore identified the man in one weekend. The man is Joseph Clinton Mills, Coach Joe, who drove Tim to and from practice. Authorities wanted to be certain before they notified the brothers. Cece Moore's final 2019 report confirmed that Joseph Mills, then 58, was living in Kathleen, Florida, about a half an hour from the crime scene. Detectives Tammy Hathcock and Russell Hurley were the next generation of Lakeland investigators who worked on Linda's case. The detectives then combed over the original case files and learned that Mills was interviewed initially, but just briefly. Mills told them that he dropped Tim off at his house and that he did not know what happened to Linda. Detectives found that Mills was convicted in 1984 of grand theft for forging a will. He never went to jail, but he was fingerprinted and had a palm print taken as well. In August of 2019, investigators compared those prints to the palm print Sergeant Pickett lifted off Linda's windowsill nearly 38 years before. It was a match. High-tech genetic genealogy had identified Mills as the likely culprit, and an old-fashioned palm print helped confirm his identity. Detective Hathcock and Hurley still needed to compare a fresh DNA sample from Mills to the decades-old DNA recovered from the crime scene. They covertly took Mills's trash back to the police department. They discovered a piece of used medical adhesive tape and sent it off to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement Crime Lab for testing. 11 days later, the tests came back, and it was confirmed that Joseph Mills took the life of Linda Slaten. Only then could her sons Jeff and Tim be informed that the monster had finally been caught. Tim said he had looked up to Coach Joe and was now sickened that he had this photo of him all these years. Even more sickening was that Mills continued driving Tim to and from practice after he took Linda's life. On December 12th of 2019, detectives arrested Joseph Mills. Here's a picture of Detective Tammy Hathcock reading him his rights. He showed no emotion and didn't ask why he was being arrested, almost as if he already knew. After the arrest, Tim and Jeff went to meet Sergeant Edgar Pickett, now 94 years old, to personally thank him for collecting the palm print all those years back. In 2022, Mills pled guilty to all charges. At his sentencing, Linda's family wanted to know why. Jeff yelled at him in court, "Why? I just want to know why, Joe. Why'd you take my mama from me? I loved my mama. We was happy." Mills's response infuriated everyone. "I am a good person. I'm not that person that they're painting me out to be." Finally, in February of 2022, Mills was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. C.C. Moore said, "We owe a huge debt of gratitude to those original crime scene investigators. Because at the time this crime was committed, they didn't even know DNA was going to be used in criminal investigations. And so the fact they collected that and then it was stored responsibly and carefully all these years by that department is so important. If that hadn't happened, we couldn't have done our work." Jeff and Tim say they're determined to move on the best they can, to live life well for their mom and for their families. The brothers also know they never would have survived their ordeal without each other. They remain extremely close, live just a few miles apart, and share passionate hobbies like restoring cars. Jeff and Tim visit their mom's grave together often and burn a candle next to a portrait of her every anniversary.